Preston Dennett began investigating UFOs and the paranormal in 1986 when he discovered that his family, friends and co-workers were having dramatic, unexplained encounters. Since then, he's interviewed hundreds of witnesses and investigated a wide variety of paranormal phenomena. He joins us now. We're talking about his latest book, UFOs at the Drive-In, 100 True Cases of Close Encounters at Drive-In Theaters. A fascinating topic. Hi, Preston, how are you?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Really good. Look, I must admit, probably like most other people in this field, that I never gave drive-ins even a second thought about whether they could be a UFO hotspot.
You know, neither did I. I actually did run into my own case very early on in my research, 1990s or so. A lady had come to work at my office, Claudia. I remember vividly, she found out I was a UFO researcher and told me this incredible encounter at the Paramount DriveIn Theater. And I just thought it was a one-off. I had no idea that this was a thing. I have to tell you, I was shocked when I found out how many cases there were.
Yeah. Is that what prompted you to do some investigation into it?
No, I just kind of let that, I investigated the case as best as I could and let it go. And was working on other cases and writing books, and would occasionally run across a case like this, but was when I was writing UFOs over Colorado, I ran into 3 cases in a row. And I thought, oh, you know what? I remember that first case I had. I'm like, this is something going on here. And I started to really look into it, and I found out, yeah, I just did a brief survey of the literature, couldn't find really much of anything in books and magazines. But as I dug deeper into, New Fork and MUFON, and other reporting centers, APRO, NICAP, their files, started to find a lot, and mostly from newspaper articles and things like this. And yeah, found over 100 cases. And these are not normal sightings, I can tell you that. There's a portion, I would say maybe 20, 30%, which are just, you're in the right place at the right time. It's a drive-in theater, it's at night, you're outside for quite some time. Your chances of seeing a UFO are much better than, I would say, being inside. And yeah, some cases reflect that. They just have what I would call a random flyby.
Right.
Something just flies overhead. But that's not what these cases are really about. Most are completely different from anything in all the literature on UFOs. Seriously.
Yeah. Well, I was reading through the cases in the book, and just the nature, I mean, they're pretty spectacular, and I can only wonder why they're not front page news.
Yeah, sometimes they are, but there's several cases where witnesses have called the news, and the news wasn't interested, and neither was the airport or the police, and they kind of gave up until they found a UFO reporting center. So I think there's multiple factors, because there's some evidence of cover-up as well in a few cases. So the ridicule factor is another. Yeah, they often reach local newspapers, but in case after case, witnesses check the newspapers afterwards, and there's nothing. And the problem is they're not reporting it, and if they're not, probably the next person isn't. And so it kind of goes down the line like that.
Yeah, you'd think that the ridicule factor probably wouldn't come into play, because I mean, we're at a drive-in and there's a bunch of people that are seeing it.
Right, and that's what makes these cases unique and really profound, because not only are they widely viewed, we're talking generally 100 people, maybe 50 in some cases, 100, 200, upwards of 3,000 in one outlying case.
Wow.
And these are very low-level sightings. These are not a light flying by at night. These objects come right over the screen, right next to the screen, right over the theater. And beyond that, these objects stay a long time.
Yeah.
So, well, not always, but a good portion of them are long-lasting sightings. So these 3 factors, there's nothing like it. You cannot find any other cases in the UFO literature in which there's more than 100 adults witnessing a UFO at very low level for a long period of time, over and over and over again. I looked up like concerts
Yeah.
or baseball games, or there's a few. I will admit there are a few, a small handful cases of UFOs over, public events, but not like this. I mean, this is
No.
crazy.
Yeah. So in your research, I mean, could you put your finger on why drive-ins would be targeted by UFOs?
I developed some theories early on and kind of considered all the ones that I could think of. I mean, one theory is that perhaps they're just curious. These are drive-in theaters seen from above are very striking. They have a huge kind of footprint that's visible, I would say, from deep space.
Mm-hmm.
And there's these giant screens and these beams of light, and that's what UFOs are all about. Someone's taken on board UFO. There's always, a colored screen, often, I should say.
Yep.
So I thought, maybe they're just curious. Like, what are these humans doing, all lined up like this? Maybe they're studying us, watching our reactions, perhaps, or using the movies to learn about us,
Mm-hmm.
which I hope not, because some of our movies are pretty violent. So those are a couple theories that ultimately, I don't think they're there to abduct people, because that's not what we're seeing. And yeah, it was very curious. I finally decided, just based on the type of behavior that we're seeing here, it's very brazen. It's very much in your face. What I would call a display, a publicity stunt.
Yep.
I believe that they are showing themselves off intentionally. I mean, that conclusion is inescapable.
Mm-hmm.
Why? I'm guessing at this point that it's to basically announce their presence.
Okay.
I don't think they're there to watch the movie. There's only one or two cases where it seems like that's what's going on here.
They hung around.
Right. But yeah, they seem to, I think that's what it is. And I'm guessing it's because eventually they want to have open official disclosure, or open official contact, rather.
Okay. I just thought I lost you there for a minute. Okay. I was going to ask you, there was one report of missing time. So would that indicate an abduction?
Yeah, that's entirely possible. That's the Ascot Park Drive-In Theater case, August 1974. And that was in Ohio. I corresponded with the witness directly, so it's a great case.
Yep.
And this is kind of the ultimate case of, drive-in theater encounters, because in this case, it's a pretty full theater, and this huge black triangular shaped object comes right overhead. He says it's much larger than the theater itself, covers the entire parking lot, and as it appears overhead, it's very low, and all the theater lights go out. The screen goes out. People's cars go out. The snack stand goes out. It's pitch black. And this object is just making a low hum, and it's moving right over the theater. Everyone's getting out of their cars and kind of staring aghast, dumbfounded. And wasn't really any signs of panic, he said. But it was definitely weird. His ears popped, some weird, strange effects. And this thing just moves overhead. And suddenly, the lights come back on. The theater's like a switch is flipped.
Yep.
And everyone just starts watching the movie again, including himself, by the way. He did not remember this incident until some time later.
Wow.
And there are other cases like this with weird memory slips or amnesia factors, which is certainly we see in lots of UFO cases, particularly close up. And these are close up. So yeah, it wasn't until like 3 years later, I think, he was in a bookstore. The witness, his name is Scott. He saw Ed Ruppelt's book, Unidentified Flying Objects, the Blue Book guy, Project Blue Book.
Yep.
And suddenly just had this flash. This is what I call a cue. We see this in a lot of abduction cases where someone will see a short person, or a bald head, or large dark eyes, or something that reminds them of an original event. and boom, they remember. We see this in all kinds of trauma victims, certainly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, it all just flooded back into his head. And he's, to this day, wonders, could there have been a mass abduction or something? It's hard to say. Uh, it's
Well,
kind of unique in that way, this case, in
because
terms of
it's classic UFO. When, especially, you know, when someone says I saw it close up, and then they say, and then I found myself, you know, an hour away from where I was, and every time someone says they saw a UFO close up, my first question is always, did you have missing time?
yeah, and I don't think it's always clear. I remember when I first began investigating, I wasn't aware how easily that could slip in. And so
Yeah.
there are other things you look for as well, in a very strong emotional reaction, um, anyone feeling physically unusual in any way, electromagnetic effects. These are all, you know, how close is the sighting? If it's within a couple 100 feet, that's a red flag for
Yeah.
sure in terms of
Yeah.
missing time
Yeah.
probabilities.
Yeah. Are people seeing the same type of UFO, or are we seeing different shapes of UFOs?
It's mostly the same shape, really. It's mostly your classic silver domed disc, usually with colored lights, which is pretty interesting to me. There are, yeah, Scott, in the case I just referenced, Ascot Park, Scott saw a kind of a triangular, more boomerang shape.
Mm-hmm.
And some people do see kind of glowing objects, so it's hard to tell because it's just a very bright light. But generally speaking, it's your classic disc. Sometimes with portholes, though, that's much more rare.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned Project Blue Book before. One of these or some of these cases have been investigated, were investigated during Project Blue Book?
Oh yeah, our government definitely knows all about this. And in fact, the very first case I found was July 22nd, 1950, which is interesting. There's none before that. And drive-in theaters were around, you know, a good
Yeah.
10, 15 years before that. So that's kind of curious and lines up exactly with another study I did of schoolyard UFO cases, which also started in 1950. And that's very close to what's happening here. These are schoolyard cases, UFOs coming down and showing themselves to groups of children. But yeah, the first case I found was the Starlight Drive-In. This is in Spartanburg, North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
The witness was Vernon Gwynn. He was a journalist, so I think that's why he was able to get some attention paid to his case. And he and his wife and other people at the theater saw this very large kind of dirigible-shaped object coming up pretty low, you know, like 1,000 feet over the theater. For once, then a second time, and then a third time. You know, by the fourth time it came over, these guys realize, you know, this is very unusual, and they're out of their cars looking at this thing, and he ends up reporting it. His report was routed to Project Blue Book, which was really very new, and actually forwarded, get this, to Colonel John Meads, who's the commanding general at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
Right.
So
Wow.
what does that tell you? I mean, that Wright-Patterson, we know that's where UFO Central.
Yep.
And so yeah, clearly they thought this was important enough to go right to the top.
Wow. What would be your favorite case then? You've got more than 100 listed in the book?
Yeah, I've got several favorite cases, so it's hard to pick. Let me see. I would say probably the South Hutch case is my favorite. This occurred in 1966, the South Hutch Theater in South Hutchinson, Kansas. I talked to the witness myself, was able to interview him. Pat Mitchell is his name.
Mm-hmm.
He was delighted to talk to me because he had never been interviewed before about this incident, and it's just a classic case with some really unusual elements. He and his friend had decided to go watch the latest James Bond flick at the South Hutch Theater, and this is a pretty big theater. It's got a screen that's about 120 feet high, 50 feet wide, one of the biggest screens around. at that time, and can hold like, I think it was like 600 cars. And they parked
Wow.
right in the middle. You know, they got there early, watching the movie. It's pretty exciting. It's action-packed, of course. It's James Bond. When his friend pokes at him and says, "Oh, look at that," and Pat saw it at the same time. Everyone at the theater had to have, because this thing was right above the screen. A little white dot off in the distance, right above the screen. It starts getting bigger and bigger, and it's obviously an aircraft of some kind moving towards the theater. And after a few moments, they could see that it was unusual. It was saucer-shaped, and it was quickly approaching at this point. And everyone just couldn't believe their eyes when this thing comes right over the theater, turns to the right, comes down below the level of the screen and stops right next to the screen.
Good. Wow.
So he knows, he's like, this thing had to be 40 feet wide, because the screen itself was 50 feet, and it took almost the whole screen. And it sat there for a good 5 minutes, maybe 3. He said it was silver metallic, had colored lights around it, yellow, blue, green, red, orange. He doesn't remember exactly, but multicolored, and totally silent. And there was no panic. Everyone was just awestruck. And this darn thing moves behind the screen. It's completely obscured by the very large screen, and then moves to the left, moves slightly upwards. Now it's maybe at 200-300 feet, and parks there for another 5 minutes. And everyone's watching this thing. And of course, no one's watching the movie at all at this point. And this thing starts to circle around the theater, and it makes one complete circle around the theater. I mean, this is obviously a display, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Makes one circle around the theater, and then starts heading down the road very slowly, 20 miles an hour. And so what happens? Everyone just screeches out of the theater and follows this thing. There's a convoy of 30, 40 cars. And Pat and his friend are in the middle of it. He estimates he was about the 20th car out. And they follow this thing down the highway for 6 miles. And it finally stops, parks again. Maybe it's 400 feet up, a little bit higher, and stays another 5 minutes. The highway is completely blocked by this huge convoy of cars. People are out of their cars just watching this thing. And by this point, they know what it is. It's a UFO that they had heard about. Pat had never seen one before. And this thing just suddenly takes off straight up. It's a little dot in the sky, gone.
Yeah.
Everyone's freaking out.
Well, that sounds pretty typical UFOs. Is like they seem to take their time. They kind of migrate from area to area, and it's almost like they're looking around, surveying, and then they'll move on again, and then bang, and off they go.
Yeah, it's very strange, because what's interesting, I think, about these is that these theaters are clearly targeted, and there's a number of kind of things that do attract UFOs. We know, like, they're very interested in nuclear power stations, any kind of installation really at all. Power stations, dams, schoolyards, but also like rocket launches, cemeteries. There's a huge list of cases of UFOs hovering over cemeteries, prisons. And here's another of what I would call a UFO attractor.
Yep. You mentioned that term in the book, so you can now add drive-in theaters to it. Yeah,
it's so unexpected. And what's interesting is the drive-in theaters were really from a bygone age to a large extent. It was 1950s, 60s, and 70s was the real heyday. And there were thousands upon thousands. But they haven't gone away. There are still hundreds. They're having a huge comeback right now.
Yep.
Right? And there are modern cases. There are absolutely cases that have occurred fairly recently.
Which is really interesting, because I mean now we live in the day of the smartphone with video cameras and able to take photos at will. So has anyone ever captured one on a smartphone?
Not yet. There's been about 4 or 5 attempts, and not one has worked. And if you ever try to take pictures at night on a cell phone of like star-like objects, you'll see how difficult it is.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
what we're waiting for is another one of these real close-up sightings. But I don't know. UFOs have a tendency to, I mean, they were ready to film it, they whipped out their cell phone, and this thing darts away. So they're camera shy for sure.
Yep.
And will even affect cameras. I've got multiple cases like that where you can't film them. Your camera on a phone or whatever will fail.
Okay. Another case I kind of took an interest in was one in California in 1972 at a Paramount drive-in, and you state in there that the audience flees in panic, so that they just abandon the drive-in.
Yep, we see this in a number of cases. Oh,
Okay, we're back. We're back. I'll ask that one. I'll ask that question again. So here we go. 3, 2. So another case I took an interest in was one in California in 1972 at the Paramount drive-in, and the audience reportedly flees in panic.
Yeah, some of these cases are such dramatic displays that the audience apparently can't handle it, and they'd flee in panic, even to the point, that there's the little tiny speakers that you put on your windshield.
Yep.
Or your door. They didn't bother to pull those off in some of these cases. They just drove off. In this case, there was some panic. This is the one from Claudia Blasios, who I interviewed, first case I ever had. And she was just a little girl when this happened. They had gone to see a movie at the Paramount drive-in, and suddenly this object appears right next to the screen, just like the South Hutch case. It's right next to the screen on the right side, huge silver disc. It's making a soft whooshing noise. It's got bright lights, and it was just sitting there like watching the people watch the movie. And Claudia first noticed it when her parents were like staring kind of dumbfounded, not watching the movie. And she saw people running by, dropping their drinks and popcorn, just
Goodness me.
dropping them.
Yep.
And cars were screeching out. What's interesting about this case is they don't quite remember what happened, how it left. As I recall, they just went home and didn't talk about it for a couple of years, and just actually didn't discuss it. And this is something we see, this weird sort of dampening effect. And what happened is they were listening to the radio, and it was about UFOs, and people were calling in to report their sightings. And this guy calls in and says, "Oh yeah, I was at the Paramount DriveIn Theater in 1972, and this object appeared
Wow. Yep.
right next to the screen." She's like, "Oh, Mom, we were there. What?
Yeah.
I can't believe that, weren't we?" She's like, "Oh yeah, I remember that." And Claudia's like, "Why didn't we talk about it?" And her
Wow.
mother couldn't imagine why.
Yeah. And the following year, there was another case I thought was amazing in Florida, a metallic UFO over the Fort Lauderdale drive-in, and the audience were amazed to see strange occupants peering back at them from portholes.
Yeah, I wasn't able to interview this witness firsthand, but I did find the report online. And it's a very interesting report. It's one of very few cases in which humanoids are actually seen. And let's see, this was 1973, Fort Lauderdale, Florida.
Yep.
And this boyfriend and girlfriend are in the theater when suddenly the theater announcer says, "Look, everyone, there is a UFO over the theater. This is not a hoax. It's a UFO." And sure enough, there was this metallic object, again, this classic saucer shape. His girlfriend was too frightened to look. She hid beneath the seat, but he gets out of the car and looks at this thing, and it's very low, and it's kind of circling over the theater, and there are portholes, and he sees through the portholes humanoid figures looking down. Unfortunately, they're just silhouettes. Can't really tell, what kind of people these are, but clearly humanoid.
Yep.
And he says at some point, it's not clear whether this is after the object left or not, the military shows up. And I have to tell you, turns up in a few cases, not to this extent. But in a few cases, yeah, there'll be jets or that chase these objects away from over the theater. But in this case, they drove up and cleared the theater out and told people not to talk about it.
Wow. Have there been any reported instances of the mysterious men in black showing up after these sightings?
Not the mysterious kind.
No.
No, if I mean like what I think are probably E.T., because people talk about men in black, and there's government agents, and there's really men in black, which I don't think are government agents.
No, no.
So no, but yeah, definitely some evidence of government cover-up. In the South Hutch case, actually, Pat was a photographer. He didn't bring his camera that night, but he had done some work for the local newspaper. And so he goes to the newspaper because he knew other witnesses had gone and reported it to the newspaper and was waiting for an article to come out, and it didn't. So he goes to the newspaper and makes a report and says, do you know about this sighting? And they played dumb, he said, and showed no interest. And that's when rumors started to fly around town that government agents had come to the newspaper office and quashed the story. Wasn't able to verify that, obviously.
Wow.
But you have to wonder, because I know they're aware of it just from there's a number of cases where these events reach the highest levels of government.
And it's no surprise, really, because, I mean, you mentioned the UFO attractors, and this is a place where a lot of people gather. So it's not just one witness that they have to deal with, it's a whole bunch of witnesses.
Yeah, one of my favorite cases was another early case, the terrorist drive-in in Bakersfield, California. This was, let me see, August 12th, 1952. And there was a lieutenant. The early cases often involved military witnesses because I think reporters and certainly our government trusted them more than the average citizen. And they're trained observers as well, which is, I think, important. At any rate, he's at the terrorist drive-in. There's a lot of people there, well over 100, watching a movie, when suddenly this object drops out of the sky, comes swooping down and parks right over the screen. Very briefly, flashes its lights. It's a huge kind of cigar-shaped object with lights on it, maybe portholes.
Yep.
And then takes off very quickly. I mean, so here we have, again, this clear, brazen behavior of wanting to be seen. And so he goes and calls the local police, Sheriff Leroy Hatfield. And Leroy Hatfield takes the report, hangs up the phone, and the phone rings again. It's another report from the same theater. And when the third report comes in, he's like, fine, I'm coming down there. So he goes down there, and there's still 100 people there. The movie is long since over. And he starts taking testimony. He takes testimony of about 20 people whose descriptions generally agree. There's always variations. And he says there was 80 people waiting to have their report taken, but his arm was too tired.
Yeah.
So he decides he's going to send it off to the Air Force, makes a report. It's routed to Edwards Air Force Base, who routes it to Project Blue Book. And this, of course, goes to even higher than that. It goes to the Air Technical Intelligence Command at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is handles the highest security cases, as well as to get this Ent Air Force Base in Colorado, which is where we track all incoming and outgoing traffic, and to the Director of Intelligence at Washington, D.C.
Sure. So they've obviously got a very strong interest, and I guess what they don't want is it being highlighted all over the media.
Yeah, certainly not at that point, because that's when we know there was a very active cover-up.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what Blue Book was. It was like, how are we going to deal with this? We know this is real. We need to handle these reports. And Blue Book had a policy, and this is verified by the guys who were in it, J. Allen Hynek, of calling these sightings hoaxes, hallucinations, and misperceptions. That was their go-to. And that's what they did. In some of these cases, which were witnessed by military personnel, did go to Blue Book, and not one made it into their, quote, unexplained or unidentifiable
Yeah.
list.
Yeah.
It's ludicrous.
Yeah. Another case that really interested me was in 1977 and in China. And who knew China had drive-in theaters? But people actually got injured and killed during this event.
Yeah, this isn't technically a drive-in theater. It's a open air theater.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm going to call it the same phenomenon because there's a very large screen, outside, and people are watching this movie. There's 3,000 people watching Beyond the Danube Delta, I believe it was.
Right.
And suddenly 2 very large glowing objects come swooping down over the audience. And they were so low that people thought at first it was going to land or crash. And they could feel the heat from these things. And it caused a complete panic. People just scattered and ran for what they thought was, their lives. These objects actually swooped very low and then didn't land, but swooped upwards and took off. But by this point, some 50 people had been injured and 2 children were trampled to death.
Wow.
Very, very tragic.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so one more case here that I took an interest in because it's my wife's home state, Georgia. June 29th, 1964, and a metallic saucer was causing havoc at the Atlanta drive-in.
Yeah. Let me see.
People were fleeing in panic. It was a pretty crowded night too. It was 1964.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to look at my notes on this one. I've got it right here because they're hard to keep straight.
Yeah, I read that. When I read people fleeing in panic. The first thing I think about is that scene out of the old classic, The Blob, with Steve McQueen in it, when they're all fleeing out of the theater. And
this is actually one of my favorite cases.
Yep.
God, I wish I could have interviewed the witness because this is again one of your classic cases where this object shows up first and kind of just flies by, and one kid shouts out, "Hey, look, it's a UFO!" And it moves off, and no one seems to pay any attention. It's very strange. And this thing returns. And this time it targets the theater, and it comes right over the bleachers there. Some of these theaters had bleachers. Bleachers were filled with kids. And it came so low, every single kid on that bleachers runs.
Mm-hmm.
And in panic. And the main witness who wrote the report runs with his cousin to the snack stand to take cover from this thing, which is so low they're afraid. And people are panicking and screaming and running around like chickens without their heads. And finally they get the courage to creep out and see what's happening. And this darn thing is right over their heads. It's a little higher up at this point, metallic, very large. He sees his mom who's waving, "We're over here," and goes running for them. And finally this object moves off. But yeah, so definitely these UFOs are wanting to get noticed.
Yeah.
They are.
That's the one thing that struck me reading a lot of the sightings that you've listed in the book was the panic that caused, and I could never understand panic. I'd be more in awe and amazement, and but I guess they tell us that they won't disclose that UFOs are real because they'll have to deal with the panic from the public. Maybe they're right.
Some of the cases I also like is what's very interesting, like one in Colorado. One of those 3 cases that really woke me up to this. This object comes right down and starts flashing bright lights, and this object extends from below and extends this very bright light. Said it was almost too painful to look at. And at this point, people start honking and flashing lights back at the object.
Right.
So there's this weird almost communication, at which point the object darts away. Yeah, often people they don't panic. They just kind of flash their lights and honk their horns. And there's this almost weird interaction.
Yep.
But some of my favorite cases we still haven't talked about.
Okay, well, let's look at some of those.
Yeah, there's the one that really, kind of for me clinched the theory that these are displays comes from UFO researcher George Fawcett, I believe it is. May 1963. This is at the Medford, or the Wellington Circle Twin in Medford, Massachusetts. And everyone was at the theater when suddenly two objects came swooping down and just hovered there for just a few moments, when two more swooped down and took position right above the original two. And then two more swooped down and took position above the others. And then two more came down. And so there were now two rows of four objects each, right? And so now no one's watching the movie. They're watching this because these are close. This is just a couple hundred feet up. And this is when the show begins. So it's as if the E.T.s, and I think that's what we're dealing with here, I really do, say, oh, you want entertainment? Watch this. No, we can entertain you. And these objects start playing musical chairs, kind of circling around from column to column, up and down, for a good period of time, 15 minutes, before suddenly resuming their original formation and going off two by two and disappearing.
Wow. And what year was that again? That was
May 1963.
May 9. So you would have had. It just would have been amazing to think that anyone would have even had a camera with them.
Yeah, it's such a shame that there aren't any photographs of this really that I could find at all.
Yeah.
Where with the schoolyard cases there are, which is strange. But again, these do take place at night. And who brings a camera to a drive-in theater?
Exactly right. So let's just looking at the time here. So we probably have a look at another couple of cases.
Oh, good. Yeah, I hope so. Because there was another case I wanted to talk about. Gosh, there's so many good cases. One case, and there's several cases where they affect the theater itself, cause the speakers to fuzz up, things like this. But another case, it was a fantastic display. I can't seem to recall the name of the theater here, but the cigar-shaped object appears, and it starts releasing smaller objects. And first, the cigar, it hovers there for 15 minutes, and they turned off the movie because they didn't want this object to, like, get up, see us. And no one was watching the movie, and it starts releasing smaller objects, which put on a complete display for another 15 minutes, and finally line up in a line and return to the cigar-shaped object, which darts off.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, these are clearly displays. Another one, the crazy Portland Twin, Scarborough, Maine, June 15th, 1975, swoops down over this theater, and maybe 50 feet high, 75 feet high, and right over the screen, 15 feet over the screen, really, causes a complete panic. Cars screech out of the theater, and not even bothering to get rid of the speakers. Only like 15 cars remained, including the witness. This thing moves over. It's a twin theater. It moves over to the other screen and does a repeat performance and clears that theater out.
Wow.
Yeah, this should be front page news. It really should.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like there was panic galore there.
Yeah, these only reached the newspapers, really, which gives little tongue-in-cheek articles like, UFO steals the show.
Yeah.
Feature attraction was not the movie. But yeah, in a Canadian case, they were appearing so much over this one theater that the owners said in their advertisement, "Come to the theater, see the UFOs."
Well, there you go. I mean, there's a marketing angle,
right? Yeah, this is an attraction indoor theaters will never be able to offer.
No. So the bottom line, it seems that the witnesses who have seen these UFOs at drive-ins probably total into the thousands upon thousands. So my question is to any skeptic out there, so, how can anyone still argue that UFOs don't exist?
Yeah, I was kind of counting up the witnesses because each case really rests on the testimony of maybe a family or a couple. There's only a few which have independent corroboration, but there are a couple. But the total number of witnesses in this book alone is well over 20,000. 25,000
It's amazing.
would be a conservative estimate. And when you think of the fact that 1 in 10 people, 1 in 100 really, report their sighting, you can up that by 10% at least.
Yeah.
So we're looking at 1,000 cases, 10,000, and a lot more people. What's 10,000 times 400, you know?
Yeah, exactly. So the drive-in theaters that are still around, you've obviously been in touch with some of the people that run those theaters.
No, I have not taken
Okay.
this investigation that far.
I was going to say, you know, probably a good idea to kind of ask them to keep you posted. I mean, if someone's going to snap one of these on a smartphone one day, and there's going to be photos or video out there somewhere.
It's a fantastic idea. You know, I bet if I did start contacting these guys, I might get a lot of new reports as well.
Yeah, yeah. The book is only just recently been out, UFOs at the Drive-In, and people can pick up a copy where? Amazon?
Yep, Amazon. I'm going to also get it through my website, which is just my name. If you Google my name, it's PrestonDennett.weebly.com.
Okay.
Or Barnes & Noble, bookstores near you. If they're not carrying it, you can always order it.
Okay. That's book, what is that, book number 26 or 27?
You know, I think it's 27.
Okay.
Yep.
You're racking them up, Preston.
I am.
What's on the agenda next? Is there another topic you've kind of been honing in on?
I'm going to write another book about people who've had very close encounters, very much like my book, Onboard UFO Encounters or Inside UFOs. Got another in my series, Not From Here, which is about outlying cases, you know, weird cases. And so, yeah, I've definitely got some things lined up.
Well, certainly look forward to seeing it. Preston, thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it.
Hey, it's an honor and a pleasure. Thank you.
That's Preston Dennett joining us. The book is UFOs at the Drive-In, 100 True Cases of Close Encounters at Drive-In Theaters.